So Emily, thanks for joining me this evening and obviously for joining the governance lunch earlier today. A very interesting discussion, and I think for me, just jumping straight into the interview here, one of the key takeaways or the interesting points for me was actually the importance of data in terms of informing future investment decision-making processes, how and where to allocate capital, et cetera, et cetera. And I think asset managers like EIG are coming under increasing pressure from LPs and from institutional capital to provide clear and transparent data reporting on what they want, what they need, which is ultimately to decarbonize the portfolio. Obviously, there are a number of different metrics and standards out there in the market. So would you be able to just elaborate maybe on how asset managers can understand what metrics they should be using to report back to institutional capital providers, LPs, etc., and which are the more reliable metrics, if you like?
Absolutely. We track quite a bit of ESG data across our portfolio, and it starts in our diligence process where we collect about 300 plus data points for each investment that we look at, and then thereafter on an annual basis once we close a deal. And we work that data up a variety of ways. So we go through a pretty rigorous data analytics process. Carbon metrics are worked up very early in the process. And there are a couple different standards that we use. Particular to carbon, we use the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, or PCAF, as our standard for developing financed emissions and associated metrics there. We also have committed to the ESG Data Convergence Project, which is a partnership between LPs and GPs to standardize ESG metrics that are reported. And we are continuing to evolve what we provide to LPs. So we report to LPs on an annual basis proactively, in addition to responding to several of their requests that we get weekly for other ESG data points as well. And this is an area where we are seeking to continually improve. And there's a lot of data that is often inconsistently reported, but I think we're on a good track to setting some leading indicators to standardize that process.
Sure, and are you able just to elaborate on EIG's approach towards goal setting and target setting? I mean, how do you manage expectations of LPs when it comes to net zero commitments?
Absolutely. We have several of our LPs are leading members of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, as we talked about today during the governance lunch, and several of them have obviously set their own net zero commitments. So we seek to be incredibly supportive of those commitments. And we have done that through a variety of ways, mostly through establishing fund-specific emission reduction or similar type targets. And it takes a multitude of forms. So some funds, we have carbon intensity linked targets that show that the fund should be consistent with an intensity that is along a net zero trajectory or pathway. And for some of our funds, we have restricted 25% of our carried interest if we do not meet those targets. Then we have other funds that have absolute emission reduction targets. We have funds that have capital allocation targets that are aligned with, again, net zero scenarios. And then we also have portfolio alignment targets for certain funds that has to do with the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change framework for net zero. So we'll track where a company is in their net zero journey to establish those types of goals.
Okay, fantastic. And do you have any examples that you can share about making net zero commitments work for your existing investments, and how is it influencing future investment decision-making processes?
Absolutely. So probably a good example that I have to share is with Harbor Energy, which is one of our portfolio companies, and they've set a net zero target for 2035, and that's a good example of an upstream oil and gas company that's setting a target, and we use that and best practices and lessons learned from Harbor's experience that we're taking and using with other current and future portfolio investments as well.
Okay, fantastic. And how do the targets that you set for yourself influence how you engage with your portfolio company? So in terms of, let's say, emissions reduction, what are the easiest levers that an asset manager like EIG can pull to drive performance improvement?
Yeah, it's really exciting actually, because what we have seen in setting these targets for our funds is that it truly is operationalizing ESG practices, risk management, and target setting throughout our entire firm, which then trickles down to the portfolio companies. So very early in our diligence process, as I mentioned, we're looking at these carbon metrics, we're thinking about actions that the company can take, and the investment teams have completely had a cultural shift in how they think about the deal and what are the ways that they can think about portfolio construction, and then as well driving down those higher emitting portfolio companies.
Okay, and I think it's interesting to have you in, obviously flying in from Houston to London today and being an asset manager active across both the US and the European markets. I mean, how politicized has ESG become in the US? We obviously had Rachel Bonfante at Chevron on the panel today, which was interesting because it provides a contrast to maybe the views of the BPs or the Shells or the Total Energies that some Europeans are so accustomed to, where their approach is maybe more towards let's diversify portfolios towards wind and solar, whereas the US approach is more towards we're going to need molecules for years to come, let's make that as low carbon as possible. I mean, from what you've seen and heard today, what's the difference between, I guess, the political landscape from an ESG perspective across the pond and over here in Europe?
Yeah, it is very fascinating. So there is this anti-ESG, highly politicized movement that is occurring in the United States right now. And what that does is it's looking at, particularly at the state level, there these anti-ESG laws that are being put into effect. There are many that are pending as well, that either restrict investment into environmental or social causes, or they restrict working with asset managers that have ESG funds or some sort of ESG product. And it's very unfortunate because it does not take into account the fact that ESG performance management, risk management is essential to fiduciary duty. And so it's something that the good news is that this is something that I think is quite localized to the United States. From my discussions with LPs in other geographies around the world, this seems to be a US-centric problem and is not a sentiment shared in most other places. So that is the positive. In terms of other regulatory activity in the United States, there is quite a lot of action around methane. There are new proposed US EPA regulations around methane for upstream and midstream oil and gas producers. And there's also the Inflation Reduction Act that sets a price on methane. And both of those are highly influential in terms of changing company behavior. And we are finding that if a company is not appropriately preparing for these laws, they are not thinking about how to mitigate methane and other greenhouse gases, they will potentially suffer significant costs associated with those activities. And so it is truly in a company's best interest, both from their own revenue perspectives and the potential to attract capital, to be very proactive in thinking about the implications of these regulations.
Sure, and I guess that touches on my last question, which is, I mean, from a policy perspective, how well equipped do oil and gas producers have to be to manage these new regulations? I was going to ask what the consequences of failing to do so. I think you started to touch on it there, but it'd be good just to get your take on that.
Yes, it is really interesting because what we have found, we've started to ask a lot of questions in our diligence process around these regulations. So as soon as we have a new potential investment opportunity, we'll say, hey, are you aware of this regulation? Most of the time they're generally aware, but then we'll dig in and say, do you know what the cost implications are of complying with this? Have you looked at your existing asset base? And this is particularly applicable to low-cost operators that might have assets that are marginal production. And what we've found, and particularly if they have wells that are end of life that will need to be plugged and abandoned, there are significant cost implications for that associated with these new methane regulations. And the response really varies in terms of being able to be equipped and be able to manage those regulations when they come into force. So that is a true potential financial risk and potential operating risk, quite frankly, of these operators that we are highly focused on. And the bar is getting quite high in terms of finding investable private companies in the US that are well managing these operations.
Well, brilliant. It's a conversation I'm sure we could continue for hours to come, but I'll wrap it up there. So Emily, thanks for joining us today, sharing your insights now, and look forward to tracking the progress going forward.
My pleasure. Thank you.